Hey everyone, it is
Ah,
Jaime Jo Wright here at Madlit Musings, and I am super excited because I have one of my all-time favorite authors, Kris Waldherr, with me today. And welcome to my podcast, Kris.
oh, thanks so much for having me, Jamie Joe. It's such a pleasure.
It's so much fun to have people on the show, and I was super excited to have you because you love all things gothic and creepy and um, literary and just all the deliciousness that goes into dark books. And so I was really excited to have you. And the book that we're talking about today is Unnatural Creatures, which is also the women in Frankenstein's life. So, I mean, what better time of year, right?
Absolutely. This is, spooky season, our favorite time.
I love it. So tell us for the readers, what's the book about? That fun question.
Okay. Well, it's Unnatural Creatures. It's a retelling of Frankenstein from the point of view of the three women closest to Victor Frankenstein and his monster.
Mhm.
So that's his mother, Caroline, his bride to be, Elizabeth Lavenza, and his servant, Justine Moritz. It's also a labor of love that took me 3 years to author. My
Wow.
intent in writing it was to reveal the untold stories of the women of Frankenstein while incorporating the revolutionary events of the era. In this way, I hope that Unnatural Creatures could be considered a companion book to Frankenstein in the same way that Joe Baker's Longbourn is to Pride and Prejudice, or White Sargasso Sea to Jane Eyre, novels that offer the other and the feminine side of the
Yeah.
story. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the feminine side to the story, which is an angle that you don't really get in Frankenstein. And yet you can tell that there's so much story there to be had.
Right, it's true. And there are other books that retell or go into Frankenstein from the
Right.
women's point of view. I mean, one off the top of my head is Kirsten Knight's The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. There's also another book that came out a number of years ago, which was kind of Elizabeth's journal, and they're great. But mine is very, very different. I set three
Mhm.
constraints while I was writing Unnatural Creatures. The first was everything that happened had to work within the timeline of Mary Shelley's novel. So I had all of these Excel spreadsheets printed out and on the floor of my office, like what happened in 1782, what happened
Oh
in
my gosh.
1785 with the different characters.
Yeah.
And the other constraint was that it had to work within the history of Europe at that time, which a lot of people don't realize. We think about the revolution in France,
Hmm.
and we all know about Marie Antoinette and the
Right.
guillotine and all that. But there were a lot of revolutions going on in Europe and beyond at that time. For example, in Geneva, where Mary Shelley has set
Hmm.
Frankenstein, there were three revolutions within just over a decade. So I
Wow.
incorporated that into my retelling because I think it definitely influenced Mary Shelley.
Sure.
The final constraint, and this was the trickiest, was that everything that had to happen, it had to be within the point of view of the women and in a way that made sense within the story of Frankenstein itself, in that,
Right.
most people realize that the majority of Frankenstein is through Victor Frankenstein's POV. It's a
Right.
first person narrative. So I had to get very inventive. And luckily, Victor is off screen, if you will, in
Yeah.
Frankenstein for years at a time. He goes off to Ingolstadt to become a graduate student, which is where he creates his creature.
Right.
So I had a number of years where I was like, well, what are these women going to do? How are they
Hmm.
responding to Victor not writing? And so that was tricky. So it either had to be that or within Victor's decidedly unreliable narration.
Hmm.
So that gave some challenges as well. But sometimes when you have constraints, it helps you be more creative. And I definitely felt
Yeah.
that way.
No, I agree. Constraints can sometimes force you to look in places that you wouldn't otherwise look. Like with my publisher and the books that I write, the constraint I have is we make it a ghost. I always say it's like Scooby Doo, right? It's like the ghost or the
Mhm.
monster all the way through, but then we have to explain it, which I'm like, it'd be so much easier if I could just keep this as a ghost, you know?
Right.
Right? It'd be
Yeah.
so much easier,
Yeah.
but I have to figure out, why is this person seeing things, hearing things? Why are things getting moved in the house, etc. And so you find yourself researching and be more creative.
Yeah, a book that the way you're describing that reminds me
Uh,
of, Clarissa Harwood's The Curse of
yes.
Morton Abbey, which he
Yes.
handles that really, really well. It's a really great read. I
Right.
thoroughly enjoyed it. So yeah, and I think that those constraints force you to go deeper into the psychology of
Right.
the characters, which is
Absolutely.
kind of what my jam is. I got people fascinate me,
Hmm.
and I'm an INFJ, so like, what is their motivation? What is their like? I won't hang out with people in the huge groups, but I'm fascinated by figuring out what their motives are
Uh-huh.
and sort of, unpeeling the onion that make them up, so to
Oh,
speak.
totally, totally. And the psychology behind it is so interesting too. Like
Oh
my
yeah.
husband's always disturbed because he'll walk into the living room and I'm reading criminal psychology textbooks, like why did this person do this? Like there's a reason. It's not just
Yeah.
random. There's something that triggered or affected or trained their brain to respond in that emotional or unemotional way that they do. And it's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's a little like a mathematical equation, I
Yeah,
think. It's like this happened and was this,
right.
and that creates this occurrence. But
Yep.
what leads up to that? Like, what
Mhm.
is the snapping point? What is the turning point? It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I enjoyed with Unnatural Creatures is you do have the three women, but they're all so very different. So you totally nailed different personalities, different thought processes, and even different motivations. So I mean, is a lot of that just your own creativity, or how did you do that research when they are off page a lot on Frankenstein?
Well, luckily, Mary Shelley has several drafts, if you will, or editions of Frankenstein. There's first the
Hmm.
1816, which was
Okay.
her manuscript. And in that particular draft, I found a lot about Elizabeth and that she was an artist.
Okay.
Um, and then you have the 1818, which is the one which is considered like the junior year anniversary a few years ago. There's also the 1823 and the 1831. Now, I chose to primarily draw from the 1831 because Elizabeth, the woman who becomes Victor's bride, is an orphan. In
Okay.
the 1818, she's like a distant cousin who's kind of fallen on hard times.
Hmm.
Um, so that gave me more of an opportunity to explore her sense of gratitude she would have towards the Frankensteins for rescuing her. Which kind of brings me back to my main supposition about Frankenstein is that I really think it is the ultimate book about bad parenting. I mean, the
No
obvious, of
kidding.
course, yeah, the obvious is
Yes.
Victor, who creates this monster and then abandons him immediately
No.
afterward, who, because this is the one aspect that a lot of people don't realize is that he's basically Victor describes creating the monster that he makes him 8 feet tall because he decides that the larger the monster, the easier it is for him to make him because his hands are a certain size.
Yeah.
So you abandon this 8 foot tall baby basically in an
Right.
attic in Geneva, take off, and then like comes back, the monster's gone, and he's kind of like, well, you know what, out of sight, out of mind, and then he falls promptly into this wild fever dream.
Right.
But so that's Victor, bad father of the year. And later, when he does meet up with his monster slash creature, he says basically like, I'm not responsible for
Right.
you. Get out
I
of
know.
town, which is awful.
It's awful.
But that's the start. But then you also look at the three women. There's
Hmm.
Caroline, who becomes the matriarch of the Frankenstein, whose
Hmm.
father, um, he made all of these really unwise business decisions that pulled their family into uh, basically bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And so she's forced to take on menial labor to support her father while he's sick and dying.
Hmm.
Then you have Elizabeth, who I mentioned in the 1831, is an orphan who her father has taken off to join some revolution in Italy. And he dies in a prison. And so she's like, becomes a beggar
Right.
until she meets up with Caroline Frankenstein, who takes her in
Hmm.
and intends her to become her son Victor's closest friend. Then finally, we have Justine Moritz, who becomes the servant to the Frankensteins after Caroline rescues her when she finds her mother abusing her. So it's
Hmm.
just a tale of, really, it's just you see these motifs
Right.
coming up again over and
Right.
over and over.
Right. Well, and I think that's a common motif, really. I mean, even if you look in society as a whole, the instability of parenthood lends so much to the instability in adulthood once that child has developed.
Absolutely.
And that can be anything from, mental health struggles with depression and anxiety, all the way to, you even look at, I researched Ted Bundy and the way he was raised, and all the things that had to misfire in his brain to turn him into the killer that he became. So much of it, I believe, was influenced by his upbringing.
Yeah, it's a whole nature versus nurture
Yeah,
question.
exactly.
But circling back about depression,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to me that Mary Shelley, we all know her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who died 11
Right.
days after giving birth to Mary.
Right.
And I know that Mary Shelley suffered from depression throughout her life.
Mm-hmm.
And, you see a lot of her own themes about loss and abandonment
Yeah.
in Frankenstein, as well as her other books. She also wrote a book called The Last Man. And I think that's how Mary Shelley really felt, that
Yeah.
she was kind of last one standing after the death of Lord Byron, the death of her husband, Percy Shelley, and
Mm-hmm.
even, the death of her children. She only
Yeah.
had, I think she had like 4 children and only one survived childhood.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, because I was reading about her the other day and I was trying to figure out how many children actually ended up surviving
Yeah.
into
Yeah,
adulthood
I think it
or
may be. Well, she also had this miscarriage,
yep.
and there was a lot of themes of just, parental loss and,
Mm-hmm.
child loss, just heartbreaking.
It is. I think, if I were to theorize, I would say Mary Shelley's writing of these novels was really almost therapeutic for her, kind of her way of expressing herself. Because I think back in that time period, women really had to just kind of suck it up and hide it. you know there was
Yeah,
there was no like
yeah, it's
acknowledgement
truth to
of the
that.
fact that you're struggling with anxiety and depression, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's what I've kind of
Well,
pictured.
I also I'm not sure how clear she was about the connection between her own experiences with infant loss
Okay.
and the writing of Frankenstein, but there is a really, to my mind, famous journal entry that she writes about a year, I believe, before she began writing Frankenstein, and I think it was 1816, that her first child died very suddenly and was only like 6 weeks old. And Mary Shelley writes in her journal that she dreams of her baby coming back to life because she
Mm.
holds her before the fire and she kind of rubs warmth into her limbs,
Mm-hmm.
and that her baby lived again. And you
Oh,
cannot but wonder, were those fantasies or wishes
right.
also influencing what happened with in Frankenstein, where
Yeah.
Victor brings this creature to life from death,
Right.
only in this very kind of, averse way where it's the
Right.
masculine approach to creating life versus the feminine.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'd not heard that journal entry of hers before. That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reading her journals, her diary entries, her letters and
Mm-hmm.
such. And she really, I think she was just somebody that she was born into loss.
Yeah. Mm.
There's the famous story of her learning to write by going to the gravestone of her mother and tracing
Mm-hmm.
the letters. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's just something that I think was a constant
Yeah.
presence in her life.
Yeah, I agree. And that melancholy definitely shows up in Frankenstein's character.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I remember when I was little, my friends were always terrified of like the vampires in Frankenstein. And I was adopted. And so I
Oh,
always wanted to adopt Frankenstein. I'm like, if somebody had just loved him deeply and
well, see,
sacrificially.
that's interesting that you said Frankenstein meaning the monster.
Right.
It's
Yes.
but that's what
I know. You're right.
culture does. It's
Yeah.
really interesting because
Yeah.
the sad thing is that Victor Frankenstein can't even be bothered to name him.
Right. He is nameless, isn't
So
he? Does he ever?
he is nameless.
That's
He
what I thought.
refers to
Yeah.
him as like you demon, you black
Yeah.
swan, and all that.
Right.
Yeah, no, he does. He refuses to name them. So one thing I have in Unnatural Creatures,
Mhm.
that one of my women creatures, as opposed to the unnatural creature created by
Right. Right.
Victor, does give the monster a name.
I love that. And we won't reveal that here on the podcast because
No, it's
everybody
something
needs to read it.
you need to read it. Yeah, I'm very proud of that.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm really glad that you gave him a name because it helped my heart.
People have been asking me, was it hard writing the monster? I actually found him the easiest because
Yeah,
Shelley writes so eloquently about
she does.
him, and I was able to draw from much of her description.
No, I agree. And it's just, I mean, it's a beautiful story. And, I struggle, sometimes I'm kind of like, why does the human heart connect so much to the story of Frankenstein as a whole and all these different characters? And I keep coming back to, I think so many of us, kind of what you've already mentioned, relate to either abandonment, loss, or that melancholy that life can sometimes overshadow us with. And I think
Mhm.
Frankenstein just really envelopes that in all aspects of all its characters. And then when I read Unnatural Creatures, it just becomes even more so because now it branches out into the feminine side of things too. So well done, Kris.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaime Jo.
So some fun tidbits about the book too that some readers may not know, and I mentioned it to you before we went on the air, was you designed the cover,
I did, yeah,
which
yeah.
is stunning.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my background is as a book designer. I have published numerous books. I have a long career. I started out working in children's books, so I was a book illustrator before I became a writer. And I've worked with numerous traditional, like big five publishers,
Mhm.
but for some reason, for Unnatural Creatures, I really felt like I wanted to bring it out myself. So I created my own publishing imprint.
Mhm.
And I just love having that option to either publish or traditionally publish.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the cover of the book is inspired very much by a very famous painting that a lot of people see on the cover of Frankenstein. Like I believe it's on the cover of the Oxford edition,
Okay.
and it's called Wanderer in a Sea of Fog
Mm,
by Caspar Friedrich, I believe is the name of the artist. So my cover is inspired by that, only with a woman in the center,
mhm.
not a man,
Right.
because it is the women's point of view.
Right, absolutely. And I keep staring at it. It's stunning. And there's some people like, well, okay, I confess, I'm one of them who may not know an author, but then I'll see a book cover and be like, bought it. I just buy it because the cover's cool. And so I actually saw the cover before I realized you wrote it, which would have been an automatic buy for me anyway. But I hit buy and I got it in my cart and I'm like, oh, cool. This is from Kris anyway. So I know I'm going to love this book.
Yeah. Oh, good, good. Yeah, I'm pretty careful about author branding like
Mhm.
that. And yeah, it was a challenging cover to design in that I wanted to be very clear that, even though it's historical, there's Gothic elements, but I
Yes.
also wanted to make sure that it was clear that it tied back to Frankenstein.
Mhm.
But it's, there's horror elements, but it's not really a horror novel.
Right, right. Well, and that's honestly one of my personal loves. Like, I mean, you look at Nathaniel Hawthorne and The House of Seven Gables, you look at, Jane Eyre's super popular Wuthering Heights, all those darker novels. It's darker, but like you said, it's not horror. I mean, these aren't jump scares, terrifying blood and gore like you'd see in a horror movie. I always call them like a literary gothic story, where
I
you're
think
just,
that's a good description for it. And there are horror elements. I mean, you kind of
yeah.
have to have that. And I was very
Mhm.
aware of that while I wrote Unnatural Creatures, that, you need to have these moments that people are like, ooh.
Right.
Um, but the scariest thing to my mind in Frankenstein is the cruelty of humanity.
Absolutely. 100% agree with you. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I think, coming from my point of view for the listeners who follow my podcast, etc., this is a book that you can read without feeling like you're going to walk away absolutely terrified to walk down the hall at night in the dark. It's not that type of a
Yeah,
a
it's not
horror.
Stephen King. It's
No.
not Stephen King or
No.
something like that. But I also was very careful to write the book. So even if you haven't read Frankenstein, which if you haven't, what's stopping you? Go read it.
Oh,
It's one of the
right, no
greatest books
kidding.
ever.
It is.
It will still work.
Yeah.
It was really, but if you have read it, there's another layer I hope that Unnatural Creatures will bring to Mary Shelley's masterpiece.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kris, this isn't your first book. You also wrote The Lost History of Dreams, which is an equally stunning novel. And have you written other books besides those two? Those are the two that I'm new to, Kris.
I have read a number. I have written a number of nonfiction books, and I
Okay.
also created an illustrated novel called The Lover's Path. That was more when I was transitioning from book illustration to writing fiction and stuff. And I have other books that I'm working on. as well. I'm always very, very busy.
Yeah.
But I've been in publishing a long time. It's kind of a little embarrassing how long I've been doing this. But what's great is that I have all these different parts of my career. Like there's the
Yeah.
children's book part,
I love
there's
that.
the gift book part, there's the nonfiction part. Like I wrote a book called Doomed Queens, which was stories of women in positions of power who were undermined. And that was kind of another feminist take
Yeah.
on history.
That's
And then
awesome.
I wrote another book called Bad Princess, which was about being a princess isn't all it's cracked up to be, and that came
Mhm.
out from Scholastic a few years ago. And so, but I feel that everything I've created as an author and as an illustrator and as a designer
Mhm.
has all led up to writing fiction.
Mm.
And I think there's a certain truth to, you know, at least for me, I wasn't really in a place where I could write fiction until I became older.
Mhm. Yeah. No, and that's fair. That's fair. But I love that you've got the conglomerate of all of that. And I think that does actually lend to the story too, because you're a very visual writer as well. So I think with your
Yeah, yeah.
illustrated, then that you're able to transpose an actual visual illustration into words that create that picture. Which I think is one of
Oh,
the reasons I
thank
love your
you.
writing so much. So
Thank you. Well, Lost History came to me in an actual dream. It was a really strange experience.
I had one book that did that as well. It is
Yeah, it's
weird.
nice when that happens.
It's
It's like
very,
being given a little gift.
you know,
And then, okay, here's the little dream. Go figure it out.
right?
Go write it.
Right.
20,000 words later. Okay, I figured it out.
Yeah. And then I tell my husband, "Oh, I dreamt a book last night." And he's like, "You're so strange." And I'm like, "That's okay."
Yeah. Have you ever had dreams when you're finishing a book that you start dreaming of something else and it's kind of your brain telling you, all right,
Yep.
you have downloaded that one. Start
Hmm.
thinking of the next one. I always love
Yep.
when that happens.
Yep. I'm really thankful that what hasn't happened yet, knock on wood, is that I haven't start dreaming about another story while in the middle of what I'm writing, where you have to keep writing because you can't possibly finish.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So you're like me, that you're a book monogamist.
yes, yes, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's just because they're so layered. I mean, there's so many pieces.
Yeah.
You can't cheat on the book that you're writing because you'd get really confused and mixed up in your lies. So
No, it's very, very true. I have some friends who can work on more than one thing at a time, but
yeah.
I think it's always like they're in different points of development.
Yeah.
And it's not like this for me, it's I couldn't do it the same day. Like they will switch, like in the morning I'll write this book, in the afternoon I'll write that book. And I
Mhm.
think it's just the way your brain is wired.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to stay focused, but I think I also get off on squirrels and rabbit trails really easily. So I have to stay
Ah,
really focused on the book that I'm working on today. And
yeah.
otherwise I'll just go off and then I won't meet deadlines, which would be bad. So
I totally get it. It's like, ooh, sparkly.
right, exactly. Oh, it's pretty. Oh, yay. But anyway, I'm a little bit like that in my conversations too, which probably drive people crazy, but I guess it is what it is. So
Yeah, it's charming.
oh, fun. All right. So readers, what's the best way to find out more about you and your books, to follow you and get exposure to your world?
Okay, well, the most obvious thing is to visit my website, and
Mhm.
that's chriswaldherrbooks.com. And you can see the spelling of my name, which is unusual, on I'm sure in show notes.
Mhm.
That's kind of the center. You can also visit readmuse.com, which is for my independently published books, but you don't see all the other ones. So
Got
there's
it.
sort of a bit of both. Eventually, I'm going to combine the two websites together.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and it seems Twitter/X. I was pretty active, but not so much anymore, unfortunately.
It's definitely changing that whole horizon of
I
Twitter X.
know.
I'm not even sure what it is.
I know. I haven't joined Threads or Blue Sky yet. I'm kind of
Yeah.
just, you know what? It's enough. You should be writing books, not on social media.
Right. I know. That's its own rabbit trail that we can get lost on as writers too.
Yeah, too easily.
Absolutely. Well, Kris, I can't thank you enough for being on today and giving me some of your time, which I know is extremely valuable. And I just really appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.